Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are currently watching us. My name is Laurent Preto, and with me today is Nicolas Alessandroni. Together, we are leading Many Many's One project. It is a large-scale study of reversal learning across taxa, and we're going to be guiding you through today's session. So we are pleased to have you join us for this really exciting webinar that's entitled What's the Use of Preregistration for Big Team Science? Preregistration is such a fascinating topic, and it has emerged as a very important and quite timely topic for many, as we are currently on developing and implementing comparative cognition tasks across various animal taxa. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about this webinar and the webinar series. This is a free and open to all webinar, regardless of membership or career stage. It is part of an open webinar series that is supported by the Open Research Community Accelerator, ORCA. And that's a project that's been made possible in part by a grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative Donor Advice Fund. That's an advice fund of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And so without further ado, let me introduce today's invited speaker, Dr. Daniël Lakens. It is a huge honor to have you with us, Dr. Lakens. So let me tell you a little bit about Daniel. Daniel is a full professor in metascience at the Human Technology Interaction Group at Eindhoven University of Technology. He works actively on improving research methods and statistical inferences, and he has published on the importance of replication research, sequential analysis, and equivalence testing and frequentist statistics. He was involved in establishing dedicated grants for replication studies by the Dutch science funder NWO, and with Brian Nosek co-edited a special issue with the first registered reports in psychology in 2014. He teaches better research practices on Coursera, published a free open textbook on statistics, received the Limer Rosenthal Prize for Open Social Science in 2017 for his course entitled Improving Your Statistical Inferences, in which more than 70,000 learners have enrolled. And in 2023, he won the Amodos Science Award for Fundamental Research in the Social Sciences. And he's currently funded by a Dutch research council, NWO Vichy project on the meaningful interpretation of effect sizes. So again, just to give you a little bit of information about the presentation, it's going to last approximately an hour, and then it will be followed by an interactive discussion with you all, the audience. And that's going to be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions and share your thoughts on the topic. So without further ado, I'm pleased to give the floor to Dr. Lakens.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very happy to talk about this topic, which I think is interesting to think about and timely. So we see an increasing number of people engage in this practice of pre-registration, and it's good to see big team projects like this do it as well. But the idea behind pre-registration is actually quite old. And I'll give you a quote of one of the first times that somebody mentioned this. And it is in exactly the context that we use it today, namely to deal with all the flexibility in data analysis that we have. So in this quote, which is by Bacon in 1966, so we're talking about a while ago, and yeah, I'm happy to see somebody in the chat already mentioned our podcast Nullius in Verba, where we always try to find the oldest possible papers already discussing topics that we talk about today. So this is quite old, 60 years, but it's very nice. So it's about significance testing and the challenge of how to deal with flexibility in the choices we make, specifically here, as Bacon writes, the decision to do a one-sided test or a two-sided test. And maybe you've had this experience that you find a p-value for your test and it's a p-value of 0.08, and the thought comes up, if I would make this a one-sided test, I could halve my p-value to 0.04, and then it would be significant. Now that's a decades-old challenge, and Bacon here says, and somehow making this decision after the data were collected and the means computed seemed like cheating. How should this be handled? And then he comes up with a very interesting suggestion of how to handle this flexible choice of whether you do a one-sided test or not. And he says, should there be some central registry in which one registers one decision to run a one-tilt or two-tilt test before collecting the data? What a good idea, Bakan. Very good idea. Should one, and then because they don't have the internet, of course, in 1966, now we can do this online, which is very convenient, but they have another smart idea. Should one, as one eminent psychologist once suggested to me, send oneself a letter so that the postmark would prove that one had pre-decided to run a one-tilt test? So it's a very nice idea, and it really captures the core of what we do now in pre-registration. Namely, we go somewhere, not a letter, but somewhere online. We specify our analysis plan and choices, such as a one-sided test or a two-sided test. And importantly, we get this date stamp. We say at this moment, which is before data collection, we carefully think about what we will do, but our analysis plan is not influenced by the results because we don't have the data yet. So we see that in 1966, we thought this would be a good idea, but we didn't have the tools to do it. But since about 15 years, maybe, people have started to seriously think about how to do this. And maybe since a decade or so, which is very short in scientific time, a decade is not long at all, we actually have the online registries to register our own studies. Now, I say pre-registration, there were all sorts of other registries before. So it's important to give credit to other fields that also started to register studies, specifically in medicine, which is the first field where registries occurred. But they are slightly different from what we now mean when we talk about pre-registration. So when we talk about pre-registration, we really mean a quite detailed analysis plan. And the original registries didn't have this goal. They mainly had the goal to just indicate, hey, this study exists. You can find that we are running this study. And the goal was actually to enable participants to enroll in clinical trials that might benefit them. So they already made clear that these studies existed, but they were not really what we do now with statistical analysis plan. Now, over the years, they have started to do this, so now they come very close. So our pre-registration is very close to the registries in medical science. But nevertheless, we're basically, all fields are trying to say, maybe we should think about specifying our analysis plan a little bit more. And I would say that one really important impetus for this is the realization that maybe this flexibility that Baknan already mentioned has been used quite opportunistically. So, of course, there is flexibility in data analysis and choices to be made, and you can make them perfectly honest, with the only goal being to discover the truth in the data and nothing else. But it turns out that many people flexibly analyze data in order to find statistically significant results. So to basically, make it more likely to support what they want to be true. And it is this opportunistic use of this flexibility that we are increasingly concerned about. There's been a lot of metascientific research, so scientific research on researchers, on ourselves, how we do science and how we analyze our data. Over the years, there have been many studies, and these are just some examples. On the left, you see a lot of the studies mentioned, and then there are a lot of questions they ask. So how often do you selectively report maybe whole studies? Or how often do you opportunistically round p-values or optionally stop data collection? Up to practices such as how often do you peek at the data while you analyze, or hark. And harking means hypothesizing after results are known. So here you don't even think about the analysis plan after collecting the data, but you come up with the entire hypothesis based on the data that you have already collected. And all of these lines and dots are basically estimates of percentages to questions such as, have you at least once engaged in this type of behavior with some explanation, often for why this is problematic to do. And then these are the average percentages in the surveys. So maybe something like 40 to 50% of scientists on average say, yeah, I have hypothesized after the results are known. So the introduction contains a hypothesis that actually is based on the data that I collected later on in the paper. All right, so these practices are maybe common, but it's very difficult to know exactly how often who has done these things. So we have a past literature where there is some indication that at least some of the time, based on these surveys, but also based on just anecdotal experiences of researchers themselves, people have opportunistically used this type of flexibility. But the data that we collect now is not really giving us the final answer of how often this happened. And actually, I think that for all sorts of reasons, we will actually never know how often people actually engaged in these kind of practices, because people might not answer honestly. The people who take part in our surveys are maybe the people who are the most honest and care the most, and other people don't. But there's also quite some variability in how people interpret these questions and whether they understand things are problematic or they take them the right way. So we're basically sort of in a situation where we think it is probably true that at least some of the time, but we don't know how often of the time, people have opportunistically used this flexibility. All right, so that's a very tentative kind of claim. It doesn't happen. Yeah, it's not that it never happens. It happens some of the time, but we'll never know exactly how bad it is. Now, okay, you could say too bad, but why do we care? Well, because then we also can never establish empirically how much pre-registration and engaging in pre-registration will improve things. Because we don't have a perfect measure of what were we doing before and how biased was it. So we cannot really do a good comparison of, well, let's say that a lot of people start to pre-register. Will it improve things? And this is a challenge in some ways because we would like to engage in new practices based on evidence sometimes. It would be nice if we can have an evidence-based story for why we should engage in pre-registration. But if you ask me, I think that's going to be very difficult to do. So it's very difficult to have an evidence-based justification for why everybody should pre-register. But don't worry, I have another reason why we might want to do it. But it's not an evidence-based reason. Because we don't know exactly how often people were doing questionable things before, we can never provide something like a cost-benefit analysis. That's too bad because it would be nice, and also because the cost of pre-registration is pretty clear. It's extra work. If you've done one, you have to sit down and it takes some time. Now, hopefully you've also experienced that it actually gives something back later. So maybe you get a better study out of it. We'll come back to research that suggests that this is often the case. But nevertheless, there's some costs to it. But we can't really quantify the benefit because the benefit requires us to say how much better have things become now that we pre-register. So this is problematic. We can't really have an empirical quantification of the benefits of pre-registration. And that leaves us with people who think that it's worth it and people who think that it's not worth it. And those two people can never agree based on evidence. They're never going to meet. All right. Now, there's another thing that we can do actually in deciding why we would engage in certain practices that is maybe a bit rarer than it should be, because we're so empirically inclined as scientists. So we very much like to have evidence to make decisions. But sometimes we can make decisions based on certain principles of how we think science is supposed to work. So this is a philosophy of science. And I'll try to explain why I think this is actually a very tempting reason to consider pre-registration for our projects, that it aligns with a certain philosophy of how we think scientific knowledge generation is supposed to work. And then it doesn't really matter if it is empirically beneficial, that we can show it, because it's just a thing that we think we should do based on fundamental principles, I would say, a philosophy. Now, to explain this, first we need to take a small step back, and that is to take a moment and to think, wait, what exactly was the problem with all this flexibility? For example, analyzing data multiple times as it comes in, or selecting a certain test based on the data, or even hypothesizing after results are known. What is so bad about this? And it's good to take a moment to think about this, because there's a concern that you might have just heard that these are now bad things. Well, that's nice, but you have to be able to say why they are bad things. And it's not so easy as you might think. For something like harking, for example, hypothesizing after results are known, you might think, well, harking, maybe you think of hypotheses that are not true. But honestly, if you ask me, if you have to hypothesize with data or without data, I would say that the hypothesis you come up with, if you actually also have some data to think about things, is probably more likely to be true. So that cannot be the problem, right? Problem is not that we might be wrong. We might actually have a slightly increased probability of being right. And the same goes for many flexible decisions we make. We might be making good decisions as we analyze our data. So we might be using our flexibility really to uncover the truth, or at least we hope. Now, it's the core of all of these practices that we consider problematic or questionable research practices, at least when it comes to data analysis, right? So the decision for a one-sided test or a two-sided test, those kind of things, the opportunistic use of these things, the core of the problem is that they reduce the severity of tests. And these severity of tests, or severe tests, this is a desirable property in certain philosophies of science. So when we think about the practices that we have discussed and saw in the presentation or in the surveys before, we have things like optional stopping. Optional stopping is the practice where you collect some data, you analyze it, you collect more data, and you analyze it again, all with the same alpha level, and you keep testing and testing and testing. And if you just do this long enough, you will find a significant result, even if there is no significant result. So it inflates the alpha level. Instead of having a 5% probability of a type 1 error at most, that probability increases and it can become really quite high. Now, optional stopping per se is not a problematic practice. Looking at your data multiple times, I should say, is not a problematic practice, as long as you control the error rate. And you can do this. Sequential analysis exists. If you think about studies like the randomized controlled trial with which the COVID vaccines were tested, those were all sequential trials. So they collected some data, looked at it, collected more data, looked at it, and they stopped as soon as it was statistically significant, but while controlling their alpha level. That still makes it what we call this severe test. So a severe test is basically a situation where you're unlikely to make an error. And as we'll see in a couple of slides, the situation should be in such a way that if you have a test, the test will tell you that you're right when you're right, and the test will tell you that you're wrong when you're wrong. Now, if we use optional stopping to inflate our error rates, the test is very likely to say that we're right, we find a significant result, when actually, in reality, we're wrong. There is nothing. So that is not something that we want our tests to have, because then the knowledge that we generate is misleading. All right. This problem of harking has also been known for a very long time. And I think a nice description of sort of the misleading nature of this was already mentioned by Venn, the mathematician, also of the Venn diagrams in 1866. And he says, an illustration may serve to make this plain. A man once pointed to a small target chalked upon a door, the target having a bullet hole through the center of it, and surprised some spectators by declaring that he had fired the shot from an old fowling piece at a distance of 100 yards. So he's basically saying, look, I fired a shot at this barn door. You see the bullet hole in the center? I did it with this crappy gun from a very big distance. Okay, his statement was true enough, but he suppressed a rather important fact. The shot had really been aimed in a general way at the barn door, and he had hit it. The target was afterwards chalked around the spot where the bullet struck. So we call this the sharpshooter fallacy. Instead of actually hitting the target, we hit the door and then we draw a circle around it. Now, again, in this situation, what is the problem? Does this show that this person is not a perfect shot? We actually don't know. Maybe if there had been a target on the door, this person could still have hit the bullseye. The point is, we don't know. The test, the shot, does not allow us to conclude that this person is a good shot. They might be. And the same goes with our hypotheses, right? It might be that your hypothesis is true if you came up with it after the fact. But the problem is we don't know and we haven't severely tested it. So that is what we do by severe test. If we first make the bullseye on the barn door and then you hit it, we know that that requires the skill, right? So you've demonstrated that you have the skill. And analogously with a test, if you predict something and you find it, we know that you have made a prediction that means something, right? That could have been wrong. So this severe test, again, basically allows you to get claims right when they are right and wrong when they are wrong. And this second part is, of course, especially important. We don't like to be wrong, but sometimes we are. I should say other people. I mean, it happens to be the case that my scientific discoveries, my predictions are always right. I happen to be always right on my hypothesis. But other people sometimes are wrong, I've been told. So, of course, now it also happens to me. So we make predictions, you're wrong, and then the test should tell you that you're wrong. So that's a very important part of science. Not the most fun part, but a very important part. So this brings us back to pre-registration. So why do we pre-register? We want to prevent this kind of harking or this sharpshooter fallacy, these kind of things. We want to prevent these kind of things. Now, it's not that you cannot deviate from your analysis or be sneaky. You can do all those things. The point is, or even deviate, and I'll talk quite a lot about this later on as well. The point is that if you have pre-registered, somebody else can transparently evaluate how severely you actually tested your claims. I can see if you did not deviate at all, that part of the test is solid. I can also see if you had a p-value of 0.08, you said you were going to do a two-sided test, and then you decided to do a one-sided test. So now this flexibility and this opportunity becomes something that I can scrutinize. Now, in the case of switching from a two-sided test to a one-sided test, I would not really be impressed by your decisions here, and I would think that is quite opportunistic behavior. But in a little bit, we'll talk about much more sensible deviations. And often they are quite sensible. Then you might still lose this severe test, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't deviate. We'll come back to it. Severity is nice to have. Severe tests are desirable, but sometimes you cannot get them, right? I mean, that's also fine. But in any case, the goal, I think, of pre-registration is to transparently evaluate how severely other people have tested their claims. That is also why we do this date. This date allows me to see that you actually came up with this plan before you had any of the data. And that's a very important part, because if you could have access to all of the data, there is no way for me to actually check if this was a severe test, right? If you already could see all the data, then maybe you just analyzed everything and then you came up with your hypothesis, and there is no way for me to know this. So that's why this distance between the data existing and the pre-registration happening before is such a crucial part of a pre-registration. Now, it also means that we can have a sort of justification for the practice of pre-registration based on a certain aim or a philosophy of science. And it sort of goes like this. If we want to generate knowledge through error-controlled claims, we keep our alpha, a real alpha, that's the maximum error rate we will allow. And if scientists should be able to scrutinize claims by their peers, right? If we think that it's important, that I can see if you opportunistically deviated from your predictions or plans, and that messes up your error-controlled claims, then we need a method such as pre-registration. We don't only need pre-registration. I mean, that's not the only way to achieve this, actually. There are a couple of other ways, if you think about it. So there are alternative methods to enable this kind of scrutiny. But I think in general, scientists would not like those, or at least not better than pre-registration. But I'll give you two examples, and they exist, one in science and one outside of science. So one method is that a notary transfers the raw data to a computer, and that computer runs some tool that tracks every operation and every analysis on the data set. So we have a complete transparent log of everything you have done to the data. And that allows me, if I want to go through the entire log, to see, have you been fishing around, trying different things, and then selecting one of the many analyses that you have run. So that would also allow me to see that your test is not severe. And this is sometimes done in very expensive medical trials. So these systems exist. We could do this. But I don't think we all want to have a requirement that we have to do our analysis behind this one computer and a notary transfers things to it. But again, in some studies, this is exactly what they do. Another example that I think we also wouldn't like is to wear a body cam the entire day. Yeah, I know it sounds silly, but I'm sure that it sounded silly 60 years ago to a police officer as well, and they now have to do it. So I don't think, I'm definitely not saying that we should wear body cams, not at all, but I'm just saying there are multiple approaches to allow scrutiny, and pre-registration is, I think, a rather convenient one for most scientists. It's a nice way to achieve this. All right, so when we talk about these kind of pre-registration practices, I have to say, tiny bit of criticism on my fellow meta-scientists that especially in the past, maybe we've become a bit stricter, but in the past, we would really be a little bit too excited about the great things pre-registration would bring us. And we would say things like, yeah, this will improve science. And we probably hoped it would, and maybe it does. But it doesn't follow logically. So you have to be kind of careful to make these kind of claims. I'll give some examples. So some people said confirmatory studies are much more compelling than exploratory studies. Now, I understand the idea, of course. This is true if one group of people is performing exploratory studies and doing opportunistic data analysis, and the other group of people does confirmatory studies where they pre-register and they cannot do this. But it's, of course, not true that everybody who explores their data is being opportunistic, right? So we cannot really make a claim like this. It doesn't automatically follow from the data. You can do perfectly fine, very reliable exploratory studies. It doesn't matter. We shouldn't make this kind of distinction. I understand, of course, if there's bad practice involved, yes, then this statement on average would hold. But the important thing is it doesn't follow logically from pre-registration. Another example, pre-registration clarifies the distinction between planned and unplanned research by reducing unnoticed flexibility. That part is fine. This improves credibility of findings. It might, but it might not, right? We really don't know. I would be happy to say that on average, in a field where not everybody is honest, and there are quite some actors that opportunistically analyze their data, on average, this is true. But of course, the risk is that we're going to move to the individual level and say this study that is not pre-registered is less credible than this other study. It might be true on average, but I don't think it logically follows. And we shouldn't say things like this, although it's tempting, right? So I think that's very important. And some people have criticized, these kind of too general statements for this. What it does, pre-registration, is it allows other people to evaluate the severity of the test. And we cannot do that if you didn't pre-register. It might be a severe test. There's just no way for me to know. So that is what it does. So I think, I'm kind of being very principled about this. Maybe you're like, Daniel, why are you talking so much about philosophy of science? Why be so nitpicky? But I think if we introduce a practice like this, we have to be extremely exact about what it actually is that it does. What do we get from it? So that's why I'm spending so much time on this. And again, I think on average, there's a case to be made that these confirmatory tests might be more accurate in the long run. But as I said before, it will be very difficult to empirically establish this. So we don't need it also to argue for pre-registration. All right, so why is this kind of practice of pre-registration especially important for big teams? Well, the studies that big teams in general do are not easy for other people to replicate, which is another way that we can sort of scrutinize the findings of someone else with difficulty often. We can't always establish why a replication study finds a different result than the original. But I think on average, when there are multiple replications and nobody can find the same result, we think, okay, that has scrutinized the original finding. And people might say, doesn't seem so easy to build on it. So maybe it's time to move on. So that's another way of scrutiny, right? Replication. But that is not really an option for your many lab projects because people cannot replicate a many lab project easily by themselves. You've set up all these great, wonderful collaborations, but people cannot redo that, right? So then you have to make sure that there's some sort of internal check and guarantee that you have some severity. Maybe interesting to know that other big projects like CERN, so the study of particle physics in Geneva, they have internal replication. They have 2 detectors, relatively independent. And I once asked, why do you have 2 independent detectors? Because that's quite expensive. And they said, yeah, because if we wouldn't have this, nobody would believe our claims, right? So you need some type of scrutiny or checking. In the case of many lab studies, replication is not really an option. I mean, of course, you could do it. You could have 2 separate many labs doing the same thing, right? I mean, we don't do it. We're already happy that we have one collaboration, but we could split them halfway in between and say, don't talk to each other, try to do the same thing. All right. But the maybe more practical thing, at least I would say, is to pre-register your studies to allow other people to scrutinize the severity of your tests. I think that's a very desirable thing to do. It is just one way to allow other people to criticize you if necessary. And hopefully, of course, it's not necessary. All right. So that's even more important for these kind of big projects. So if we can't do other ways of scrutiny, then you have to build them in some way in your workflow if you want to make sure that other people trust your findings, right? So that's, I would say, a very compelling reason, especially for these big projects, to, I would say, always pre-register. All right. Now, what else do you get? Because I've been so strict, and the only thing I've mentioned is that it allows other people to transparently evaluate the severity of the test. Is that the only reason we do it? There are other benefits of the act of pre-registration. So there's research mentioned here where you get better thought through analysis plans, better experimental designs, and also more clearly articulated hypotheses by filling out the pre-registration. Now, this is nice, and people have pointed this out, right? So here, there's all these kind of benefits it has. It also has some downsides. So doing the pre-registration is pretty stressful or somewhat stressful. I mean, they didn't compare it to finding a null result or, or finding out you made a mistake in your study. That's also stressful. So if it prevents that, maybe the overall stress is less, but doing a pre-registration is hard work and the project duration is a bit impacted. Maybe a little bit. Now, these are things that follow from pre-registering, but they are not necessary, right? The date stamp that we do in pre-registration is not necessary to just think more carefully about your analysis plan. You can just do this. You can just, as my parents would say, sit on your hands for a little bit. Don't do anything. Don't directly collect the data. Wait for a bit. Think carefully. But of course, pre-registrations and templates help us to do a better job. So that's another benefit you get. It's not required. You don't have to pre-register to get these benefits. You can get them in other ways, but they're kind of nice that you get them. There are some other studies that show this, that people who pre-register say that it allows them to better plan their study and that there's more transparency in how the study has been done and analyzed. So you get all these kind of additional benefits. And again, the only thing it costs is time, but that's also important. People always say that pre-registration costs time, at least in advance. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Okay, this direction. So although you don't need pre-registration to get these benefits, they're kind of nice. And again, for very research intensive projects, I would say you want to think as carefully about your project in advance as you can. And if you take a pre-registration template to do this, that's sensible to do. All right, so if you pre-register, there's a lot of things we have to learn about how to do it, and a lot of diversity in how people currently pre-register. Very often people describe a little bit what their tests will be like. So we see verbal descriptions of analysis plans. And that's better than nothing. But often there's a lot of things that remain quite vague in a verbal pre-registration. You can try to be very accurate, but if you think about it, did you really specify the assumptions of your statistical test and what you would do if you deviate from them? Now, maybe you did, because there are checklists that guide you through all the things you should report. So that is good if you use those. But still, often there are some things that remain vague. So in general, the gold standard, that's not easy, that's why it's like a high bar, is to pre-register in analysis code. The best case, and again, that's not easy to achieve at all, is to have analysis code and a simulated data file that looks very similar, or a small pilot. You do data collection a little bit in advance. You have a couple of data points, enough to fill your data frame. You can run any test on it that you would want, maybe just with 6 participants, that doesn't matter. And you can do the analysis, click all the buttons, and then you save the script. And in essence, unless weird things happen, you can just run that script on the final data set that you have collected, and you pre-register this analysis script. It's good to try this. Regrettably, the more details you add, the more you would have to maybe deviate, because you specified a lot of things. So there's a bit of a conflict here, like a dilemma, right? The more specific you are, the clearer it is you deviate, but don't worry, we'll come to deviations later, and they're not as problematic as you think most of the time. Yeah, so that's just what's going to happen. All right, but I would recommend this. I also have some less than generally accepted opinions about pre-registration, and we can discuss them. But I have good reasons to think some things. So there is a lot of pre-registration templates for all sorts of studies. For example, secondary data analysis is often pre-registered. Now, the table here on the right comes from peer community in registered reports, and they distinguish certain levels of access to data, and they ask you to indicate at which level you are when you pre-register. Yeah, and at the bottom, you basically did everything. You have seen all the variables, you looked at the data and everything. Well, okay, so you really know the data well. The top is kind of the classic case. You don't have the data because it doesn't exist yet. Well, in that case, it's clear that you can pre-register. Number 5 for secondary data analysis is also fine. In number 5, the data exists, but somebody else guards it. So you don't have access to it, and this person can say that you don't have access to it. The UK Biobank is a good example of this. They have a lot of data. If you want access to it, you have to email them, and then they will give you the results of your analysis, but they guard the data. So that's an example of level 5. But I would say anything below this reaches the point where you basically could, if you want to, analyze data and make your predictions based on the data. So I am strict, as you have noticed maybe. I'm strict, and I try to be principled, and I would say pre-registration is best for those on the top. On the bottom, you can, of course, be transparent. That is good. But then maybe you don't need pre-registration per se, because I would like pre-registration to be this special thing where we can transparently evaluate the severity of a test. And I cannot do it if you already had all the data. So if you have all the data, you will do secondary data analysis. I would say maybe you don't need to pre-register, but try something like an open lab notebook. Have complete transparency in what you've done, log everything. But I don't necessarily need to see a date step for when you had a prediction, because I know that you could have had access to that data before the date stamp anyway. So it doesn't mean much to me. All right. Just to make it slightly more controversial, there's also a lot of templates for pre-registration in qualitative research. Now here, I'm a bit more ambivalent. I can definitely see cases where it's worthwhile to do this. For example, there are certain approaches where you would want to replicate the work of somebody else. You do a certain test, and this becomes very close to what we call scientific realism in these kind of qualitative studies. But actually, a lot of people have different goals. They don't want to test something. Qualitative researchers have many more different epistemologies. The severe testing is often not at the core. If it is at the core, by all means, pre-register. But I think we should not force people who do qualitative research with a different type of philosophy to pre-register. I don't think that matches what they are intended to do. So I think it is good to make that distinction, right? That we think that if it doesn't fit, then you don't do it, right? I mean, we don't want to make this a sort of blanket requirement for everybody. All right, good. So now let's go to this point where it turns out that it's often difficult to pre-register perfectly. And the more detail we add, the more likely it is you'll have to deviate somewhere when the data is finally in. Because you pre-registered all your analysis, you did everything, and then it turns out that you didn't think about, oh yeah, well, in my case, I'm an experimental psychologist. So maybe I didn't think, what should I do if a drunk participant walks in? Yeah, I didn't pre-register what I would do, but it kind of makes sense to not include their data maybe in my reaction time study, but I didn't pre-register it, right? So there are a couple of situations where you might need to change your analysis plan. And let's discuss what the consequences are of this. Now, we should also expect that this will remain common for a long time. And we can learn from this other field I mentioned before, these registries in medicine, that slowly also added more and more detail about analysis plans. People have been doing a bad job reporting everything in a clear way for decades. I mean, they're doing better and better and better. That's not the issue. But we shouldn't expect to get this perfect in a very short time scale. That is just not realistic, and it didn't happen in other fields. It will not happen for us as well. So we will always have to deal with the situation where pre-registrations aren't perfect, and there is a little bit of decision-making afterwards. All right. Now, first of all, if we deviate from our analysis plan, often, of course, this can be for very good reasons. I like Paul Mill, a psychologist. He says, don't make a mockery of honest ad hocery. That's a very good statement. Of course, honest, not opportunistic. Honest ad hocery is a very important thing to do. So, of course, some people say, yeah, Daniel, I pre-registered this analysis, but now I see it's really flawed. We'll come back to a couple of reasons to deviate in a bit, but this is really flawed. Should I report my original pre-registered analysis? No, of course not. If it's really flawed, I mean, and you realize it, then do the right thing, report the right thing. I mean, I'm not saying don't say that you pre-register, you did, you can say something about it, but you don't have to report flawed analysis just because you pre-registered them, right? Now, deviations can often be improvements, and we should expect this to happen quite a lot, maybe up to the point that we know exactly what to do so often that, yeah, that doesn't happen as often. But I think in the beginning, we should totally expect this. When we start to deviate, we can still use our philosophical basis. That's the nice thing of having a philosophy, to think through the consequences. Yeah. So we're going to trade off, in this case, if we deviate, we're going to trade off this severe test because we didn't stick to our plan. So we deviate from it. We don't have the same level of severity as if we would have had if we did not deviate. But we trade it against something extremely important, namely validity. We're going to do a more valid analysis, or we're going to compute a more valid mean from our test scores or something like this, right? So this is the trade-off. And if you're forced to make this trade-off, validity takes precedence over severity. Sort of the same point as saying measurement takes precedence over statistics. It doesn't really matter what you compute if your measures are not valid, right? The same thing about validity. So you can pre-register your test and do a very severe test, but if it's not a valid test to begin with, yeah, why would we care that it is severe? So it has to be valid. That's always more important. All right, so now we have this trade-off, validity versus severity. And we can make a sort of 2x2 diagram here where we have deviations. Some are opportunistic. They actually lead to lower validity. And some are in good faith, honest ad hocery, and they increase validity. Now, we can also have tests with lower severity, the tests where we deviated, and tests with higher severity, the tests where we stuck to our plan. Now, in the best case, and I should say this, of course, it is very desirable to have high validity and high severity. That is where we should want to be, difficult as it might be, but that is where we want to end up, right? We want to have tests that are very severe. That's why we pre-registered in the first place. And of course, valid. So we already knew the right way to analyze the data and to calculate all the scores and stuff like this. We should also not move towards a science where people pre-register, but then we're totally okay about all deviations. We should accept them as something that we probably can't avoid, but some people manage to pre-register perfectly. And we know this also from metascientific research. They know their research topic so well, maybe because they've already done 30 sort of similar studies in the past and they know what they're doing. They can pre-register an analysis plan and they don't need to deviate. Approximately 10%, only 10% or so of pre-registrations manage. So that's not very common. But the people who manage, we should be impressed. That's a good thing, right? Okay. That being said, often you will not be in this 10%. You will deviate. So what are the consequences? Well, then, of course, we should deviate because we get higher validity. So, for example, we deviate from a pre-registration to exclude some observations that are definitely not caused by the processes that are related to the research questions. We remove outliers like the drunk participant that I mentioned. We did not pre-register this, but we know that the reaction time scores are going to be very low. We don't want that to pollute our data. It's honest ad hocery, and we kick them out. We have a more valid data set left, but we have given up a little bit of severity. All right. Now, there's also the option to stick with your severe plan, but have low validity. It's just not desirable at all. You follow a pre-registered analysis of all the data, even though, for example, 15% of respondents didn't follow the instructions. Yeah, those people should not be included in the data set, right? So here you should deviate, but if you don't do it, well, then you have high severity, but low validity, not desirable at all. And of course, the worst case is the opportunistic, hacking, questionable research practices. You don't have high validity. Your analysis is only there so that you get a significant result, and it is not severe because you deviate. Now, that's the worst case, right? You don't want to be there. But on the right side, it's fine. You can stick to your plan and it's valid, great. But if not, deviate, but then make sure that you have higher validity. That means that in our discussions of when we deviate from our analysis plan, we have to have a small discussion about what are the consequences for the severity of the test and what are the consequences for the validity of the test. And we'll see that there are some cases where the severity of the test is almost not impacted. Let's start here with a couple of scenarios that could happen. There could be an unforeseen event. There's a fire in the building. There's a snowstorm in your country. You wanted to do data collection for the whole month, but then there's a snowstorm. And the last, what day is it today? Yeah, the last 4 days of the month, you can't do data collection. It's a deviation from your analysis plan because you said, I'm going to collect data for the entire month. Does it have an impact on the severity of the test? Not really, right? Almost not. It was out of your control. You can communicate this to your reviewers. You can say, look, I couldn't get into the building. It was out of my control. It is not that I opportunistically decided to stop data collection. It was out of my control. I had to. Well, how can it impact the severity of the test? You didn't do anything opportunistically. It's a deviation, but I would say with no consequences for the severity of the test. So you can just report it and say, well, okay, it's not how I planned it, but it doesn't have consequences. So now, with our framework of severity, we can start to think, wait, are all deviations actually equally bad? And they're not. Sometimes they have no consequences for severity. Here, there's also no consequences for the validity. You just have slightly less data. Well, it has some validity or some severity consequences in the sense of your statistical power is a little bit lower than planned. You have a little bit less data. That's the only thing you would discuss here. All right, then we have mistakes in the pre-registration. They also happen often. I mean, literally, somebody once emailed me and said, Daniel, I wrote down in my pre-registration, X will be larger than Y, but of course I meant smaller. Really happened. Really happened. And it was an honest mistake. In this case, luckily for this person, this was very theory-driven research, building on a lot of things. Everybody in the field would say, yes, of course, it's smaller. I mean, it was not the critical test anyway, but one of the tests, everybody say, yeah, of course, it has to be smaller. This is an honest fluke, a mistake, an honest mistake. And I think you can just justify this and say, I wrote down the wrong words, but everybody can see that it wouldn't make sense to do it otherwise. I don't really have options to test it in the other direction. There we go. You didn't really have flexibility to be opportunistic about it. And then, of course, you can say, what is the consequence for the severity that I flip it around? The whole test is flipped around. But actually, we all agree. Every reviewer, and a good faith reviewer, would say, "Nah, okay, that's fine. No worries." So again, we can evaluate the consequences for the severity of our test. Might be not so big. Now, I have to say, I'm giving you all examples where the consequences are not so bad. But of course, often there will be consequences where it is just bad, and that is life. And then we're trading off severity for. Missing information is a case. Yeah, if you didn't specify what you're going to do with outliers at all, you're just going to lose severity because there are quite some options. But we should not treat severity as a dichotomous thing. It's not all or nothing. How many alternative ways are there actually to deal with outliers, realistically? What happens if you apply all of them in a sensitivity analysis? You apply all of them and it doesn't matter. Well, then you could still make the point, well, all possible reasonable ways of dealing with this thing that I didn't specify don't matter. Again, that's the best case, of course, for you. You can say, so there is no big impact on the severity, right? All right, so all of these situations basically are a case of, yes, there's deviation for a certain reason. The other two are there's assumptions that are violated. You didn't test for them, but they're something that you thought would happen. People would read the instructions or something, and okay, it doesn't happen. And then you can sometimes falsify assumptions. The normality assumption is violated. That's the last category. In any case, there are good reasons to deviate sometimes, and always there's this trade-off of severity and validity involved. All right. So we can try our best at these pre-registrations, and then some people are quite critical about these deviations. I would love to see somebody actually go through all the deviations if people honestly report them, and that's already something we've had to learn in recent years, that it is very good to have a table somewhere in a supplement where you really go through all the things you said you would do and then say, and we did it as we said, oh no, this one we deviated from. We've learned this a couple of years ago, that that's a sensible procedure to build in. So let's say you have these tables, they're available. Now people start to do it for a couple of years. We have a lot of them. I would love some meta-scientific study where somebody goes through them and says, actually, you know, a lot of these deviations, yeah, they're not perfect, but they're also not so severe. So meta-scientists who study deviations would, for example, say 90% of studies deviate. But then if you go and take a look at the data, maybe 50% of these studies deviate because they say we will collect 300 participants, but they end up with 298. Well, I don't think that's a very severe deviation. So if you just look at it black-white, there's a lot of deviation. But if you ask me, I think there's not a lot of very, very big, important deviations. But I mean, sometimes they might be there for good reasons, but many might be inconsequential. So don't be too worried about the amount of deviations, but look at how bad they basically are. And then there's another thing we would need to do, and we don't know if we're able to, but I think hopefully we can get pretty far. And that is have a discussion, an honest discussion. How bad is it if you deviate? What are the consequences for the severity of the test? Sometimes we can simulate it. We can know this statistically through sensitivity analysis, but sometimes we don't. Yeah, okay. And then we have to see whether we can have an honest discussion about the consequences. Otherwise, yeah, we can't evaluate the severity in some cases. I hope in many cases we can. Now, if we take a look, as I mentioned before, what is the most common deviation? Actually, it is the sample size. We say something like we will collect 300 participants, but it's very difficult to end up exactly with 300 participants. So it's maybe sometimes better to not have a hard number there, but some procedure where you say, look, we will collect data on this platform until this thing happens. And then we know that there's a certain reduction because some of the entries are false and we have to exclude some people. But you don't really know exactly the sample size. Don't fix it maybe. I mean, unless you can perfectly control it, of course, then you can. But in many studies, this goes wrong for this reason. So we know this is a common deviation. People should report it, but people don't. And I think it's useful to know that if you might think, oh, I don't want to report my deviations, I hope people don't find out. And I've heard that many people don't even check your pre-registration. So if this is your mindset, you have to be warned that in the future, I think we will have a lot of tools that actually will do these things automatically. Some already exist. We actually are working just on a tool that will grab pre-registrations automatically and show it to people just to make it easier to check. So we have that. But there's also a very interesting reg check app. So registration checker that uses AI to actually really compare the paper against the pre-registration. And the LLM says, hey, I'm noticing some discrepancies here and here. And I think over the years, we can expect that there will be more and more of these kind of tools. In general, there will be more sorts of automated checks of all the work we do. But definitely of pre-registrations, it already exists. Now, you can also use this, of course, before you submit your paper. You can take a look. Hey, did I actually miss something? Maybe the AI will already be helpful. This is the second version, was just released last week, of RegCheck, this AI tool made by Jamie Cummins in Bern in Switzerland. It works pretty well. So give it a try. None of these tools are perfect, of course, but they might be helpful. All right. So I think hopefully I have been able to convince you that this practice of pre-registration can add value for people who have a certain philosophy of science, which is based on severe testing and thinking that, yeah, we build trust in claims if they are supported by these severe tests. And we want other people to be able to see that I have severely tested something that is added value to the research project, especially in big projects where replication is difficult. And they, in general, also work best as registered reports. So this is a talk about pre-registration, not registered reports. But if you are pre-registering anyway, and you have the time to go through the registered report format, you also get peer review, which is very useful at a point where you can still improve things. And it prevents publication bias, which pre-registration doesn't do. You can, of course, pre-register. And actually, a while ago, we did a study looking at how many pre-registered studies actually end up in the scientific literature. And more than a third of studies never ends up in the scientific literature. So that's another problem, not related to pre-registration. That's only about the severity of our tests, but publication bias is also a problem. And registered reports happen to be a great solution for this. So if you pre-register, also consider folding them into a registered report workflow. All right, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to your questions about these topics.